Hi, I think we're on the air. I'm Paul George with History Miami, resident historian. We're going to wait just about a minute or so for some folks who might be tuning in or soon to be tuning in. As you know from what we mentioned on Wednesday, we'll be talking about the history of Overtown in today's lecture. And I want you to buckle up because there's a lot of information. It's a very, very fascinating topic, and I look forward to sharing it with you. We'll just wait a half a minute or so and we'll get going, okay? And I wanted to give you some background on essentially my introduction to it, other than growing up in Miami and being aware of it. We'll talk about that a little bit too. So we'll get moving in just a minute, okay? Or less. Delighted to be with you. I see that Norm Orovitz is watching, which is terrific. And Vanessa, who's our IT guru in charge of photography, she's there too, thank God. Lainey Rada, who's a tremendous history buff, been to a lot of talks and tours and doing a lot on her own, is watching. So we're really happy to have you with us. And I hope that these talks are filling at least a slight void from the everyday humdrum life of being sequestered. Hi, Carla. Last saw you, I think, at the Miami City Cemetery tour. It's great to have you back. So why don't we do this then? Let's go ahead and launch into Overtown, which was known initially as Colored Town when Miami was incorporated in 1896. But the history of African Americans in the Miami area, of course, goes back long before that time. We can go back at least to a couple of slave plantations that were on both banks of the Miami River in the 1830s and 1840s, owned and run by South Carolinians. That would be Richard Fitzpatrick, who had a slave plantation he pulled together in 1830. It lasted through the opening salvos of the Second Seminole War, which began at the end of 1835. And his nephew then would resuscitate at least a portion of that plantation to the best of our knowledge. And our knowledge of William English, his nephew's slave plantation, is very limited. But ironically, we do have a rock house in today's Lomas Park that purportedly was slave quarters. We know it also served as an army fort in 1849 and again between 1855 and 1858 as part of the Third Seminole War. We also had African Americans, more specifically African Americans of the Bahamas, in Lemon City in the years soon after the end of the American Civil War, in the years of late Reconstruction. Reconstruction began in 1865 and it was essentially over in 1877. And we had African Americans there farming and creating within this larger white community their own community with 3 small churches, among other things. So it's a fascinating story, the Lemon City Bahamian Black story. And of course, Coconut Grove is probably the most famous area that hosted a large African American Bahamian, again, enclave, beginning with Mariah Brown coming there, settling along and building on Charles Avenue in 1889. And that became a very significant community, very important community. It spread throughout what today we call the West Grove. Many of the homes are still there. Many of the descendants of the original settlers are still there. It's a very fascinating place. I conduct about 3 or so tours a year along Charles Avenue and points around there. And it's been a real popular tour, thank God. But to get to the origins of Colored Town, today's Overtown, we'd have to go to the incorporation of the city of Miami, which took place on July 28, 1896. And we should note that in order for, under state code, for an area to incorporate as a city, as opposed to a town or a village, which would be smaller commodities, it would have to have 300 registered voters. So John Sewell, who was in charge of Henry Flagler's construction projects in Miami, rounded up, as he said, his black artillery. He had a lot of African-American workers, many of whom were Bahamians, and he marched them over to register as voters. In fact, there were about 182 black voters who attended on July 28, 1896, the incorporation meeting. Altogether, there were about 368 voters in and out of that meeting over a course of many hours when the city was incorporated. So you had that representation. One of the early chroniclers of Miami history, a very interesting man, and the first documented Jewish settler was Isidore Cohen. He wrote a memoir that was published in 1926. And in that memoir, he said that the most intelligent address in behalf of Enduring Incorporation was delivered by A.C. Lightburn, who was a leading figure among the earliest black residents of the city of Miami, one of the founders of Greater Bethel AME Church, and he'd held some really important positions in Reconstruction era Florida long prior to this time. Very, very eventful life. In a very short period of time, he died at age 59. When Miami was incorporated, within a matter of days, weeks, at the most months, a separate section essentially in the northwest sector of the new city was set aside as a segregated neighborhood for black residents. And it was called Colored Town, which was a pretty common name for segregated black neighborhoods in that era. It was the proverbial west of the railroad tracks, the FEC right-of-way, which would be around a little bit west of today's Northwest First Avenue. And it extended as far north as the original city's northern boundaries, which would be today's Northwest 11th Street and Northeast 11th Street. And then west over to the city's boundary in the west, which would be Northwest 7th Avenue, south to Northwest 6th Street. It was called Colored Town, and again, that was where African Americans were constrained to live, although there's one notable exception. We talked about the roads the other day. We didn't have a chance to talk about it, but there was a little area in the roads inhabited by African Americans, again, many of Bahamian background, who in all likelihood were workers for the Brickles, who had thousands of acres of land in and around that area. It was called South Miami. And even though you had a segregated black neighborhood, Colored Town, you did have South Miami roughly from Southwest 8th Avenue to Southwest 4th Avenue, from Southwest 8th Street to Southwest 11th Street. And what the city leaders wanted to do was they wanted to tear it down and put all the folks living there into Colored Town. And this was a big thing on their agenda in the early 1910s. The problem is there had been a court ruling in Louisville, Kentucky that had thrown out a similar attempt in that city. And so the city leaders backed off of it. You still would have had Bahamian blacks as late as the 1930s living in South Miami in part of today's East Little Havana. Meantime, you did have a segregated Colored Town. There were, of course, the early institutions of any vibrant community, and it was clearly, despite discrimination and Jim Crow discrimination, a vibrant community. You had many churches, including Greater Bethel AME and a historic missionary Mount Zion Baptist Church, and many others in that community. You had the Oddfellows Hall. You had a lot of retail. S.W. Brown had something called the Colored Town Bargain Store on Southwest 2nd Avenue early on in the city's history. The population of that neighborhood, at least percentage-wise, comprised, depending on what decade we're talking about, but stretching all the way from the early 1900s, well in and through the 1920s, anywhere from 20 to 40% of the city's population. So it was a high ratio in terms of the black population at that time, much higher than it is today within the city's borders. It was very cramped. And I wanted to share with you something. My introduction, again, to this topic academically came when I was researching my dissertation topic at Florida State in the mid to late 70s. The dissertation was entitled Criminal Justice in Miami, 1896 and 1930. I had a separate chapter on police and African Americans. And I went through, a tremendous amount of documents in the process of putting this together. This is one of the things I have, and this is footnoted. It appeared in the Miami Daily Metropolis and the Miami Herald, that in 1920, to show you how cramped it was, Colored Town, social workers discovered in that year, 1920, 100 families residing in one block, while a single lot on another block contained 9 cottages, and those would be the shotgun houses. So that's how cramped it was, because the city, reinforced with its police force, constrained the black population, despite its rapid growth, to the original borders for a few decades at least before it began to expand in a northerly direction. It was heavily West Indian, meaning Bahamian, at this time. In fact, more than half of Colored Town's population, according to the U.S. Census in 1920, were of Bahamian background. Disease was rampant because there wasn't really proper sewage removal. A lot of homes didn't have bathrooms inside. They had outhouses. So for that reason, there were a lot of problems. It wasn't regular garbage pickup. There was a school entitled, and you can't get much more banal than this, prosaic than this, School Number 2. had to be a school by state law, even for different races. And that's why that school popped up in 1896. But there was no high school until Booker T. Washington opened up in 1927. There was a hospital, and it came on the heels of the Great Flu pandemic of 1918, and that was the first Christian hospital, which opened up just after the pandemic of 1918 in Colortown. There were many luminaries, many prominent people there, and they had great impact in their community because a lot of them were benefactors of the community that received very little from the city in terms of amenities like parks and paved roads and a library and things of that nature. They included D.A. Dorsey, the first black millionaire, a man by the name of Farr, Kelsey Farr, who was a funeral director, S.W. Brown, the man I mentioned before, who ran the Colortown bargain store, R.E.S. Toomey, the first licensed black attorney in Florida and a civic activist, Lawson Thomas, who came later, the first black judge in the area and one of the first black judges in the South since Reconstruction, the Reverend Graham, who headed the Mount Zion Missionary Baptist Church, Reverend John Comer, who was the liaison, if you will, between the white power structure of Miami and the black community. He headed St. Agnes Episcopal Church, which was one of the most significant Episcopal churches, no matter what race, within the Episcopal Diocese of South Florida at the time. Sam Solomon, who was an activist who registered more than 1,000 African Americans to vote, very, very important. Dr. John Brown, who was the leader of the sit-in at McCrory's Five and Dime store in 1959, but also active in a lot of other black civil rights movement activities. The Reverend Theodore Gibson, who was actually based in the Black Grove of the West Grove, he headed the NAACP, and they of course had a tremendous influence over civil rights, especially by the late 50s through the 60s and 70s. Employment, what did people do who lived in Overtown in those early decades, all the way into, say, the middle of the 1900s? They worked as draymen, that is, they operated horse-drawn carriages, usually at the railroad station, to carry people to their destinations once they came in. Longshoremen, domestics, hotel porters, leather tanners, mechanics, tailors, gardeners, construction workers, blacksmiths. There were many blacksmith shops that were on the western edges of Miami, a little bit south of Colortown, and some of them apparently worked there. You also had women working as nursemaids, as laundresses, as cooks in white homes. And so they would trek over to white homes during the course of a day and then come back, of course, to Colortown in the evening. Activities were plentiful. It was a community that celebrated a lot of things despite, again, the disparities that arose from Jim Crowism. There were parades, there were many clubs, there was a Red Cross chapter, fraternal orders like the Oddfellows Club, black nationalist groups like the Universal Negro Improvement Association, a Marcus Garvey created group. There were religious holidays that were observed. There was Juneteenth, the day of the Emancipation Proclamation, June 19th, 1865, was celebrated each year. Also, Bahamian British holidays were celebrated since there was such a large Bahamian population there. As time evolved, Northwest 2nd Avenue became the main street for entertainment, for institutions. You had movie theaters such as the Lyric Theater on that street. Different clubhouses were there. In fact, it was known as Little Broadway. And as time went on, you had some fantastic clubs like the Harlem Square Club, the Rockland Palace, on and on and on. Little Broadway, a.k.a. Northwest 2nd Avenue's heyday, was in the 1950s into the early 1960s, when really it was really an entertainment center that drew a lot of whites and drew a lot of African Americans, many of whom had been performing on Miami Beach but couldn't live there, stay there, so they would come to Overtown. Oftentimes they stayed there at the Mary Elizabeth Hotel or the Calvert or another hotel, and they would sometimes jam at some of these clubs late at night, early in the morning. Northwest 3rd Avenue was also significant too, as a major entertainment venue and a hotel venue. You did have an area in the northwest sector of Colortown known as Hardyville, named for a sheriff who had broken up, back to you, that had broken up a red light district, and he pushed the prostitutes into that section of Colortown, and it became what they called Hardyville. And it had a lot of patrons, many of whom were white. You also had jazz music sometimes in the parlors of those houses. Very interesting place. to put it mildly. But there are also associations here that fought to make Overtown, despite the odds, a better place, like the Negro Uplift Association, the Colored Board of Trade, which fought segregation. These were early on groups that maintained their busyness for several decades. Again, the city was adamant in constraining and containing the borders, maintaining the borders of Colored Town. And there was an occasion in 1911 when there was a tacit agreement between people living on the periphery that there wouldn't be any folks moving from Colored Town beyond the original borders. And so the city talked about a color line. And that was a euphemism for blacks being constrained to the original neighborhood. But yet their population was growing so tremendously that space was becoming a premium. And that color line held till 1915, when a few families moved beyond the color line west of Northwest 7th Avenue into and near the neighborhood of Highland Park, which was a new suburb, if you will. And a riot broke out with whites opposing that in a violent way, and police, of course, buttressing their opposition. And so these families were pushed back into the original borders of Colored Town. And then, of course, there's the larger picture of blacks in the criminal justice system. You didn't have a black policeman called patrolman until 1944, even though there had been requests for that going back to the early 1900s. You had a black man, the first of at least a handful, who were hanged. A man named Richard Didwile, if you can imagine this, was indicted for the alleged rape of a much older person, an older lady, a white lady, and he was tried, convicted, and sentenced in a trial in court, circuit court, in less than 30 minutes. And he was hanged. He was hanged in an area where the old courthouse was, just east of today's Miami Avenue, just north of the Miami River, which was then the county courthouse. The police, it seems like they had quotas for arrests, and they would always rush toward the end of the month to arrest a lot of African Americans on vagrancy charges. You could be just standing on a corner and be arrested for that reason. So, I mean, there was really a tremendous two-faced policy in terms of justice. One of the toughest of all the police was the police chief, H. Leslie Quigg, who was indicted in 1928, for the murder of a black prisoner. He was acquitted. He had the best attorney in the city, a man named Mitchell, who got him off. Mitchell Price. You also had the Ku Klux Klan, and they marched through Colored Town in the 1920s, and they were complicit in white terrorism as early as 1921, kidnapping a white minister of a black church, St. Agnes Episcopal Church. When he was preaching what today you would call a black power message, he was kidnapped, tarred and feathered, thrown out of a car on today's Southeast 2nd Avenue, just south of Flagler Street in 1921. Nobody was ever hauled in for the crime. You had also the Klan drive-through Overtown, Northwest 2nd Avenue. It made Life magazine in early May, the outset of May of 1939, trying to intimidate blacks from marching to the polls in a citywide election the next day, which would have been March 2nd, 1939, led by Samuel Solomon, whom we mentioned earlier. Despite the attempt at terrorism, it included a effigy of an African-American hanging from a noose in a truck. Despite that attempt at terrorism, 1,500 blacks did march to the polls. And the polling station, incidentally, was the old fire station number 2, which was restored, renovated about 5 or 10 years ago near Northwest 14th Street and Miami Avenue, North Miami Avenue. You finally had a police court by 1951, and that's where Judge Lawson Thomas, who also was a tremendous civil rights leader, became the judge. The growth of the black community finally in the 1930s and beyond spread beyond its original borders at today's 11th Street all the way up to 20th Street. And then in the last several decades, housing was built in the southern sector of today's Wynwood up to about 22nd Street west of Northwest 2nd Avenue. And that became a African-American enclave too. There were efforts to look into the future during the depths of the Great Depression. County pulled together a planning board to project the future of Miami once it emerged from the Great Depression. And it was chaired by none other than George Merrick, the creator of Coral Gables. And what that board said in 1935-36, and its report was, the city will come back. The city will come back from this economic downturn, and when it does, it's going to grow again. We've hitched our start to tourism. What we need to do, though, is understand that as it grows, it's going to need more of the center city neighborhoods to handle this growth, because center city was everything in those days. So the projection was that black growth would be pushed in a northwesterly direction, and indeed into today's Liberty City, Brownsville, and places like that, which has happened. There was Good Bread Alley, and I know that Vanessa was going to put a picture of Good Bread Alley up on the screen. This was an area where the disease was rampant in Colored Town. It stood between Northwest 14th and 15th Streets and Northwest 2nd to 5th Avenues. Rampant because, again, sanitation was almost non-existent on the part of the city there. You had these tiny shotgun houses that were just cheek by jowl next to one another. And the Miami Herald ran sort of an expose on it, which improved things a tiny bit, but it continued into the 1940s. One of the problems here with housing was the heavy white investment in Colored Town. A man named Luther Brooks headed Bonded Rental Agency, which is kind of an innocuous name. They controlled thousands of apartments. Other whites also own real estate there, as well as other businesses like food purveyors and things of that nature. We have statistics. In the 1920s, less than 10% of blacks owned their own homes in Colored Town. In 1940, Colored Town consisted of 92% renters. In many cases, renters spent more than 50% of their income on rent. And we hear a lot about this today, not so much just African Americans, but everybody in general. Look at this here in terms of percentages. In 1950, white landlords owned 70% of what was then being called today's Colored Town, or today's Overtown, was being called the Central Negro District. In 1960, whites owned 80% of those properties. Overtown's name became Overtown, essentially, unofficially, after World War II, clearly by the 1950s into the 1960s. And there are explanations for it. People from Liberty City saying, I'm going to go Overtown, drawn by entertainment, or maybe they're a physician. Also, people from the West Grove, I'm going to go Overtown, drawn by the same factors. And so we begin to hear it referenced as Overtown. We did have benefactors in the community. Dr. Ferdy Pacheco and another physician who preceded him, Dr. Nadler, set up virtually free medical clinics on Northwest 2nd Avenue and 10th Street, right in the heart of that entertainment district in the post-war period. And we do have a move from shotgun houses to concrete monsters, aided by a federal housing act in 1949. So that in 1947, for example, shotgun houses comprised 80% of Colored Town's housing stock. By the 1950s, there's a pell-mell rush to replace them, to level them with concrete monsters, which, of course, on the part of the owners, would have been much more profitable so you could pack more people into them. Expressway construction, of course, caused a huge population displacement. There's a brilliant historian, Nathan Connolly, his mother's a good friend of mine, who's on the faculty of Johns Hopkins. He wrote a book about 4 or 5 years ago that I'm reviewing for the Journal of Urban History. It's called A World More Concrete. And it's about Overtown and the importance of land owning and land holding in every way. And he indicates in his studies that I-95 caused a direct expulsion beginning in the 1960s of 8,500 households from what the city was calling the Central Negro District, and encouraged the flight of thousands of more people. In all, 87 acres of highway interchange ran through the middle of the Central Negro District as it does today. And what it did was it resulted in a dramatic population drop. From, according to the 1960 census, about 34,000 plus people lived in today's Overtown. Those numbers had dropped by the early 2000s to about 9,500 people. And these stories just go on and on and on. I know we're running out of time, but I wanted to talk very briefly about today. There's so much else I had to leave on the drawing board for this talk. Great changes have been underway in the last many years. Great advances after a long period of dormancy beginning in the second half of the 60s because of highway construction, because of metro rail construction, because of urban renewal. We're beginning to see great changes. The Black Archives has done a lot in that area with the Lyric Theater and with their own library there, as well as their museum that includes one of the finest collections of art by Purvis Young, a brilliant black artist, long gone today. Community Redevelopment Agency money has helped a lot in that area. New private sector investment has really altered it. Many new apartment complexes, large apartment complexes, tastefully designed, have emerged in recent years. Marcus Samuelsson, the celebrated Ethiopian chef who has the Red Rooster in Harlem, is opening up in Overtown, and Clyde Killens, who was a musical. Okay, we're back. I have to ask my daughter how to keep phone calls out of this situation. A lot of new private sector investment, as I mentioned before. Target Complex is coming to an area where the Mary Elizabeth Hotel stood at one time. Okay, here we go. That was my best buddy dialing in from Louisville, of all places. Resuscitation of the FEC railway right-of-way has led to tremendous development, both along the railroad's right-of-way, but also edging into the eastern sectors of Overtown. So as I see it, in terms of development and activity, and I think future prospects, Overtown is in a much better way today than it has been for a long period of time. I'm going to spend at least a couple of minutes trying to answer questions. Your new book is out. Well, I'm working on the Brickell Avenue book is due to be published pretty soon. Pinnacle Housing, Norma Orbitz mentions, has built a tremendous apartment complex also on the edge of Overtown, the northeast edge, yes. Amy Saul, Amel Saul has said, are you saying the Harlem Red Rooster has an affiliate in Miami? Yes, right on Northwest 2nd Avenue between about 10th and 11th Streets, west side. And it's going to be very exciting. Right now, they are distributing meals to a lot of people who are hungry in that neighborhood. So it's really been quite a story. Just trying to answer a few more. Amazing topic. Okay, let's see. Video will be available, it'll be up and going. And would you have time to discuss Kelsey Farr? Kelsey Farr was a leader in Overtown, a funeral director. He's the one that created one or both of the black cemeteries, heavily Bahamian black cemeteries in Brownsville. A real mover and shaker in the community. And can you put subtitles? I cannot follow this fast speech. I know, I talk way too fast. Have you been to D.A. Dorsey's house? I would love to visit sometime soon. His house, a replica of his house, stands on the exact site of the previous home that was built in the early 1900s. The previous home went up in flames in the early 1980s. It's on Northwest 9th Street between 3rd and 2nd Avenues. It's been used for different institutional groups as well as a thrift store at one time. I'm not sure how it's functioning now. Let's go for a final one. Steve Richards, do you see vestiges of the old cracker regime from the old days? Hardly any vestiges. I was just talking to somebody the other day. It's so rare to hear the term Myanmar anymore, but as late as the 1970s, it was all over the place. So why don't we do this? I want to thank you all so much for tuning in, and I think I'll try to slow my pace of speech if I possibly can. On Monday, we are going to discuss George Merrick's Coral Gables, and I think you'll find that very interesting also. So why don't we go ahead and do that? Have a wonderful weekend. And if some of the folks have questions on Colortown, you might want to just hold those or just send me an email, MiamiHistorian@gmail.com, and I'll be happy to answer them. But History Miami thanks you for tuning in. I, Paul George, also thank you. Have a great weekend, and we'll look forward to seeing you then on Monday. Thanks so much. Bye-bye now.